writes. So that's the rest of the metaphor. Experience will write. And then I will know stuff because experience gives me information through my senses, right? Locke is the one that comes at least to realize that when I see, hear, taste, touch, etc., everything that I'm experiencing is all in my mind. This is all written on my tabula rasa, right? So it's now a tabula fulla. Sorry, it was just funny. You know. I don't know what the opposite of rasa is. Plain, full, I guess. But in any case, Locke realizes that what I see is an interaction between me and the objects that I'm seeing. And what I'm experiencing is not the object as it is in itself, right? It's instead how my senses interpret what they're experiencing, right? So it's my perspective on the thing. I'm not seeing the things as they are in themselves. Instead, I'm seeing them as they appear to me. And so he called these the secondary qualities of the thing. So I'm only aware of the secondary qualities, which, you know, you could look through this whole thing. I mean, there's all this stuff is available on the internet, of course. So if you wanted to look up secondary qualities, an essay concerning human understanding, which of course is actually on the web, so you can read all this yourself if you're interested. And that's where he describes the different kinds of qualities things have. The secondary qualities are the things that we see here, and so those are the things that we experience. He goes on, however, to point out, because he's also going to invent something called materialism, that everything is made up of material. That's Aristotle. You know, everything has to have substance, right? But for Locke, it's atoms that are uncuttable, you know, little hard things that exist and don't get changed by their contact with other things. But as they all clump together in different arrangements, they end up creating different types of matter. You know, so if you're like Sir Isaac Newton and you're a chemist, you're still trying to figure out how can I change matter from one form to another. You know, if I mix it with just the right things, I can get, you know, Harry Potter. Okay, so that's, I don't know if you've ever heard of Harry Potter, but one interpretation of that whole 7-book children's story is the alchemist story, because Harry starts off as lead, and you get 3 elements that mix with Harry, his lead character, and that's Rubeus, which is red, Hagrid, Albus, which is white, Dumbledore, and Sirius, black, which is black. And so red, white, and black, you know, mixed with lead, transform it by book 7 at the end to gold, which is why the cover of the 7th book is the sunrise showing a very gold-looking color, because Harry has become gold by destroying Voldemort. So it's not just transforming lead into gold, it's also transforming lead characters into virtuous gold characters. So just another squirrel, right? But of course today we know that we don't actually have a basic material. Instead, what we have is atoms are not uncuttable. We've figured out how to cut them. And we end up then with the idea of quarks. You know, so what we've got is energy in an arrangement, and just keep in mind that energy is not a substance. It's spirit.
See, but we get mixed up in that. I think a lot of people think of energy as like, yeah, it's not substance, it's this magical glowing thing. It's like, no, there's two types of energy, potential and kinetic. There's no such thing as a big glowy force of energy. There's no force, like in that sense. Anyway.
Well, we do have our standard model, which gives us the idea that there's you could break light up into different sets, and the one type of light we call electromagnetic energy, because it's light at a particular wavelength that we don't see, but we can certainly power things with. Then we have the other force, which has been called gravity, but they're working on that because gravity doesn't really exist. And yet there is such an attractive force. We've talked about that a little bit already. The model is changing. We don't really have an adequate way of dealing with it yet. And then the strong and weak nuclear forces, right? Which are, you break the wavelength up, and part of that is visible light. So, okay. But in any case, so Locke's materialism is no longer considered correct. But it was a new thing at the time, and actually I would typically argue that his materialist point of view is actually common sense in our society, as most people think, this is a cup, no doubt about it. It has primary qualities that make it a cup, and that's what I'm sensing. So even though what I see, hear, taste, touch, etc. is all influenced by the way a human person's senses interpret the experience of holding a cup, there is still a physical cup here, as far as Locke is concerned, right? So there are primary qualities of the cup that I can hypothesize are there, even though I can't actually see them at all. Well, of course, the problem of this thesis, which once it's accepted, and even as a commonsensical way of thinking about it, we realize that, the cup is real, it's here, but at the same time, what it looks like and how good a cup it is depends on your individual perspective, and our perspectives are different. Not only because you're sitting there and so you're all getting a different angle view of things, but at the same time, because your cultural experiences might, predispose you to think of this cup as being what a waste, They spend all that money on, you could just have paper. A paper cup will work just as fine, and not have cost so much energy in order to make so much, which is just going to end up in the dump anyway one of these days, right? Actually, I like it. And actually, it was free.
So does this kind of relate to like Aristotle's whole chairness of the chair kind of concept? Like what makes a chair a chair? What is the chair?
Yes.
A chair?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. But so, the issue starting with Locke, and the reason that it's called British empiricism is because, okay, it's an empirical point of view, but at the same time now you have this conflict that what I'm experiencing isn't something that tells me the truth of the situation, but instead gives me a prejudicial point of view that I have because of who I am and where I'm from and so on and so forth. So how can we get outside of that prejudicial point of view to discover the real thing, right? And by the way, I'm happy to say that we haven't solved that problem yet at all. And it just gets worse, because the next person that comes along is let's do George Berkeley first. He's a personal favorite, by the way. He is the person who's honored by a college in California that mispronounces his name. So instead of George Berkeley, they say Berkeley University. Doesn't have any relation to the Lawrence Livermore Berkeley labs somehow. But in any case, yes, that college is honoring him. He, notice he also died before the revolution that gave us our United States. He thought of himself as Irish, although his parents were British who moved to Ireland. But in any case, he was also a bishop when he died. But his famous connection to the United States, or to the colonies really, was that he came up with the idea and said to one of his friends, who also was an author and had a connection to a noble, that got him to see the king and suggest, let's build a college in the new colonies. And so he was approved with funding to go and create a college. And where he was going to build it was on Bermuda. And the main reason for the college was to teach ministers, so that the colonies would have their own source of ministers for the Church of England, right? Anglican Church. But first he goes, he gets married. I guess if you're going to do all that stuff, you need a wife. So he said, and they got married. Came to Providence, Rhode Island, where he wanted to build a farm to feed the people that were going to be running the school in Bermuda. He never made it to Bermuda. He spent 2 years in Providence, Rhode Island, building this farm up, having slaves, having children, and he had brought books with him for the college, and as a result of him, after 2 years, coming to conclude that the king was not going to send the funds as promised, and so he gave up and he went back to England. So he gave up, so of course he didn't actually start a college, but he did leave his books in the colonies, and he donated half of them to a upstart college called Harvard, which is one of the two, and the other one was Yale. And so their starting libraries began because he donated a large amount of books. In fact, one of the collections is still there in a honored position. The other one, the library burned down and those books were destroyed. I can never remember which was which. I'm sure it's just, you just have to ask and you'll know. Probably even see pictures of the original books in a shelf, In any case, so he was, kind of neat. But why bring him up in this case? Because as a critic of John Locke and his materialism, he says, the materialist philosophy, one of the effects of it is that it does away with the need for God. Because in this materialist philosophy, all the atoms, etc., are created at once in the creation and ordered by God in a particular way. The clock kind of metaphor, right? Wasn't organic yet. It was a clock idea. And it's an insult to God to think that the clock needs fixing every so often, because God, of course, is perfect and so made a perfect clock. So this clock is just ticking and everything is predetermined, doesn't need fixing interaction, doesn't need a God in the machine, a deus ex machina. Instead, it just is ticking along perfectly fine, thank you. What's the point in trying to pray or ask God for help or even listening to God in any particular way? God's a creating God. And by the way, this is where you get American deism instead of theism. Theism is the description we have for believing that there's a God and you can talk to this God. Deism, on the other hand, American deism specifically, and Jefferson is an example of an American deist, wrote his own version of the Bible, by the way, which you can, it's on the internet, so you can, take a look at it. And his main contribution there was he looked at all the sayings associated with Jesus and decided for himself which things he thinks Jesus really did and what things he didn't. Jefferson, he's brilliant enough to know, Jesus didn't do that. So he separated the diamond